Well, hi everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. We're going to be talking about the pains and the challenges and perhaps the pleasures of having great privileges on the system, especially when it comes to users that we're working with, and as it pertains to the ALLOBJ special authority that I think many of us have heard of, have some fear of, but aren't really sure necessarily how to work to remove it or even what it necessarily entails. My name is Robin Tatam. I'm the Director of Security Technologies here at Help Systems, so it's my honor and pleasure to be speaking with you today and sharing some of the knowledge that I have picked up over the years as I work with customers around this very topic. It's certainly a very common discussion and conversation, and so I'm happy to be able to have that discussion with you as well. If you do have any questions as we go through here, feel free to shoot me an email or hit me up on Twitter. I'm always following those and be happy to answer any of those questions for you. In my role here at Help Systems, of course, part of that responsibility includes doing these types of webinars, but I'm also one of the subject matter experts for Common, so I attend those events. And this year I was also recognized as one of the IBM Champions for the Power Systems platform. So there's lots of ways that you can reach me and get a hold of me, and love to have those conversations with everybody. One of the common comments I get from people, not necessarily that they're just users. I think we all understand that there is potential that people can do things to the system when they have a profile on the server, but there is a mindset, I think, that many times the user is constrained somehow. There are some limits on what they can do, either artificial limits based on perhaps familiarity or a lack of knowledge with the system, or from a technology perspective by putting a menu in front of the user or constraining them within a particular application. And so that's where we need to explore today. We need to understand how real that stuff is and whether that really is keeping us as safe as we perhaps like to think it does. Now, when we talk about users on the system, of course, we can't really go past the idea that this is considered somewhat of an insider threat, as opposed to an external threat coming at us from outside of the perimeter firewall. So the three basic types of insider threat are negligence, maliciousness, and of course the all-important accidental. Many times the things that happen to our server were not done from somebody or by somebody that had any malintent. It was simply that they pressed the enter key and the system was configured in a way that they were able to perform that task without either being challenged or told that that was beyond the scope of their responsibilities. Now, there are some statistics here that I thought I would share with you. I'm a pie guy, so I like to show it through a visual mechanism, but 1/3 of the businesses tend to enforce what we call a least privilege principle. And what that means is that we have an idea that when a user signs into the system or when they connect to the server, they start off with little or no privilege to access anything. And then as they demonstrate a requirement for a particular application or a database that is part of that application, then the doors are gently opened in order for that user to access the information. We also understand that 2/3 of businesses have experienced some kind of data theft or data corruption that originated inside that firewall. So we have this idea that 1/3 of the organizations is securing their system, but somehow 2/3 of the organizations have experienced some type of data event. And those two things just simply don't add up, because what we need to understand is why people are not actually implementing more of that least privilege mindset. In fact, this is very important on the IBM system simply because the default configuration for the server is actually the opposite of least privilege. It's actually what we call an allow all model, meaning that if you have a user ID and you have a password, by default, the database is wide open to you. Unfortunately, most organizations are simply unprepared for any type of cataclysmic cyber event. If you talk to an IT person and you give them the idea that there could be a power outage or a fire or flooding in the data center, they probably have a very well-defined practice plan of action on who to call and what processes to instigate in order to initiate a role swap or to transition the tapes to a recovery center and to bring that system back online. But if you model that against some type of cyber event where files are becoming encrypted or servers are becoming unavailable due to denial of service, then unfortunately that plan is often lacking. With a traditional disaster, many people decide to do a role swap. They'll declare that disaster and they'll bring up a backup system. But if you think about it, that HA system, that DR system, oftentimes is not differentiating between normal business activities and some type of accidental or malicious event. If something gets renamed, deleted, or encrypted, then the HA application is typically going to ensure that that same object is touched in the same way on the backup system just a few nanoseconds later, meaning that we don't have the luxury of simply declaring a disaster and doing a role swap. We're now forced into recovering for backup media and hopeful that that backup media was not impacted in a way that we hadn't noticed at the time, only to find that now we can't recover from it. If some of you are as old as me, you may remember the original Superman movie series. This one, I believe it was Superman 2, but our friend the villain here actually was working for a bank and discovered that there was some rounding going on when it came to processing the payroll. And so he wrote a computer program that would take all of those rounding processes and deposit the rounded amount into his personal bank account. Now, if you remember that movie, you may also remember that he did get caught, and part of the reason that he was discovered was that he was then taking that money and, of course, living a little high on the hog. He actually drove in the next morning in a red Ferrari, brought a lot of attention to himself, and, of course, that was enough to get him in hot water. When we look at this in reality, there are some similar traits. In fact, when we talk about red flags associated with insider threat, we find that more than a third of people caught doing this kind of thing were living a life that was beyond their normal financial income. And before you chuckle and say, well, then you know a lot of people, it really just comes down to the idea that people that are doing things against the rules within an IT environment oftentimes try to keep constraints on who else is going into that system or looking at those controls, because obviously that's going to increase the likelihood that they're going to get caught. Probably not surprising as well is that a many number of these types of folks have good relationships with vendors or customers. Perhaps they're giving some excessive discounts or making some decisions around the relationship that perhaps is not officially sanctioned by the business. So these are all red flags that often accompany some type of insider threat. This is a challenging thing to discover. In fact, it takes a long time often for this to be uncovered. And that's a significant period of time perhaps that allows that user to move around the system, to potentially cover their tracks, or to take the scope of what they're doing really up to the next level. So that can be a real pain point, as opposed to perhaps somebody coming in from the external side of the firewall and making some noise or generating some chatter that is a little bit easier to discover. If you go out to the web and take a look at, for example, any of your favorite search engines and type in examples of insider breaches, you'll find tons and tons of examples. We often don't hear about this. In fact, it's perhaps not always disclosed because, of course, it is embarrassing to the host organization, not to mention that in many instances these things are the person moves on or they are relieved of their position, perhaps for different reasons, and the activities then cease. So that's all pretty general. It's not necessarily centric to an IBM or a Power Systems environment. It's true for pretty much any IT-centric enterprise. So what about IBM? Where does this really play in? Well, the first thing we have to understand is that the I in IBMI stands for integrated, meaning that everything is all kind of tied in and built together. That means that anybody you give a profile to, in essence, has the virtual keys to that system, and we have to recognize we're taking a gamble if we think that somebody's not going to even attempt to drive that access. And ultimately, whether you think your users are knowledgeable enough or have that type of that access, ultimately would you bet your entire business on it or your personal career? And oftentimes when I hear from people and they say, hey, nobody in my organization would know to do that, or they've worked here long enough that why would they ever do that? What we're forgetting, like I said earlier, is that a big cause of a lot of data events simply comes down to people making mistakes. It's not about trust. It's not necessarily about people having that access. It's the fact that they've attempted to do something that perhaps was misguided and the system allowed them to do it. We also have to bear in mind that when somebody does come in from the outside, when they get through that perimeter, which typically happens in just about every data breach out there, then they're not coming in as some anonymous profile. They're actually coming in leveraging the credentials of an internal user. So if your users, well-intentioned as they may be and as perfectly careful as they may be, if that profile falls into the wrong hands and has more power than it really needs, then you have exposure that the profile could be misused in a way that you're not expecting. So what are user profiles? What are users when we use that vernacular? Well, it really comes down to three main concepts within IBMI. There's the traditional user profile. These are the capabilities that are defined and created using usually the create user profile command, but maybe Navigator if you're familiar with that tool. We also have system service tools or dedicated service tools users, and these are profiles that allow the user to work with some low-level administrative type functions in IBMI. If you're familiar with the BIOS of your PC as an example, it's pretty similar to that. It used to be that a user could get directly into that environment with a certain authority, but IBM recognized that there was some risk involved there, so they put a user ID and password requirement in front of that environment, which I think was a great idea. Thirdly, we have validation list users. Now, the premise here is that you have an object known as a validation list that is able to store data in an encrypted state, and from that, we can retrieve it or check against it. Now, the reason we might store credentials there as opposed to a traditional user profile is oftentimes when we have, say, a web application. We may have a storefront that allows a user to create a shopping cart or an account that they then revisit later. If we were to create a traditional user profile for each one of these users, we may find that we just become inundated with these profiles, and in many instances for users that perhaps will never return. So storing it more as data within this validation list object allows us to store lots of this information, validate that the user profile and name or the password that the user provides is indeed correct for that account, but it doesn't influence or impact the traditional IBMI infrastructure. Today's focus is going to fall on the traditional type of user because for an administrator account, for example, this is typically where we're defining it, and this is where we see a lot of assignment of privileges that perhaps might be questioned. So a traditional profile is actually an object on the system. It has a type of star user profile, much in the same way a file is an object and a program is an object. It's just a different type. And the purpose behind that profile is to define the capability associated with that profile. In other words, when they sign on, what menu do they see? Is there an initial program that runs? Are they allowed to run commands on the command line? So it's all the attributes associated with that user's account stored so when they sign on, they're ready to go. IBM gives you a number of these profiles predefined on the system. You're probably familiar with QSECURITY and QSECOffer. That's good examples of traditional IBMI profiles. There may be other user accounts that are created as part of the operating system depending on which licensed products you have installed. So for example, QBRMS is a profile associated with the Backup Recovery Media Services product. If you don't have BRMS installed, then you probably won't have this profile. Now, many times when we audit systems, we look at these Q profiles, And we get the recommendation or the observation that customers are omitting the Q profiles from their review, simply expecting that to be an IBM account. And while that is an unwritten rule, in essence, that all IBM profiles start with the letter Q, and most people know that, there is nothing to stop you creating your own Q profiles. And if somebody's trying to do something malicious, one of the most obvious ways that they will try to cover their tracks is that objects that are created are placed in the operating system areas, such as QSYS library, and they're given names that begin with the letter Q, because many times we're afraid to actually interrogate them, or certainly to make any changes out of fear that we're going to break something associated with the server. If you've dealt with or read into any of the regulations that many of us are now dealing with, such as GDPR, PCI, Sarbanes-Oxley, many of them have accommodations in there for the idea that there are going to be administrators on the system. They typically refer to them as privileged accounts or powerful accounts, but there's no actual legal definition for what this is. So when somebody says, oh, you have too many privileged accounts, how do you know how to measure that? How do you know how to go determine who those users might be? So I thought I would share with you some of my gray hair, give you a definition that I like to use when I talk about administrators in an IBMI context. Now, there's really three criteria that I look to initially. It's, first of all, somebody has one or more of the 8 available special authorities. We're going to talk about those special authorities here in just a second. But anybody who has one or more of those, I would consider typically to be a privileged account. It could also be somebody who has private authority to an application or a database. If everywhere the objects are, Robin, you can do this, and Robin, you can do that, then all of a sudden I become a privileged account. It could also be as simple as being a profile on a system that has very permissive public authority. Again, I'll explain more about some of these concepts here in just a moment, but I'm sure many of you have heard of Star Public. You may not be 100% familiar with what it is, but it's really just a default permission that is associated with every object on the server. Right? Now, the reality is, and something we've learned through doing the State of IBMI Security study for more than 15 years now, is that most servers have very permissive public authority. So when we talk about a privileged account, then we need to understand that, unfortunately, in that using that measurement, we find that most users are privileged. Now, if you have met one or more of these 3 criteria, then you typically also need a way to execute commands, not just command line. There are other ways to run commands, but a way to execute commands in conjunction with perhaps a way to access the database. So it can be possible to have Microsoft Excel, for example, making an ODBC connection and pulling data from the database. It could be somebody using an FTP connection in order to send a command up to the host. All right, so what I'd like to do now is just talk to you a little bit about those 8 special authorities that I mentioned a moment ago, so that you understand kind of what the 8 are and the main attraction associated with each one. So the most powerful of all the special authorities is ALLOBJ. This is unrestricted access to every object on the server. Now, bear in mind, virtually everything is an object, so this really is the keys to the kingdom. Not just your application programs, even the application data, but even the operating system itself. Then we have a security administrator privilege. This allows the user to create and manage the user profiles on the system. Now, there is a safeguard in the operating system that says you can't assign a privilege to a user that you yourself don't have. So, for example, if I'm a security administrator, but I don't have ALLOBJ, I can't give the ALLOBJ privilege to somebody else. But there is a little workaround for that, so let's be careful. I'll talk more about that in a moment as well. We have I/O system configuration, input-output. So we're talking here about the communications of the server, varying on and off devices, starting TCP services like FTP, changing that TCP configuration. Not something that an end user typically ever needs to be able to do. If you're a large shop, you probably have an audit team, maybe internal, perhaps external. And the audit privilege here allows the profile to be able to turn on the built-in cockpit voice recorder, if you will, on IBM I, and to be able to record and interrogate the logged events. For most shops that don't have a separate audit team or a large administrative staff, this is often combined with the security administrator role, but IBM I does support that separation of duty. Spool control is the all object of spooled files, which is just printed output that has not yet come out of the printer. So in other words, it's sitting in a queue, it's visible, and what we have to remember here is that that data, while potentially cryptic in the database, is now nicely formatted with column headers and page breaks and is easily visible to anybody who can get to that queue. And if you have spool control, there's going to be no restrictions on that, even if you have explicitly said, this is a queue that I don't want the users having free reign to. For example, if you print your own payroll, this is a great example where spool control is extremely dangerous. Service privileges allow the user to get to the front door of that SST and DST environment that I mentioned a little bit earlier. If you have service, you can get to the door, but starting in version 5 of the operating system, you also had to have a valid user ID and password specifically for that environment. Job control is often given to users so that they can do some benign tasks like starting a print writer. But job control is a very powerful administrative privilege, and it in some instances allows a user potentially to bring the system into what we call a restricted state. In other words, bring the server down into, in essence, a version of Windows safe mode where users can't connect and it's intended for administrative activities only. And then lastly, but by no means least, we have save system privileges, which allow the user to be able to save any object on the server. Now, saving an object might seem pretty innocent, but what we've got to remember is when we're saving something, we're actually taking a duplicate of it. And that potentially allows us, in essence, to restore it somewhere else. So we take that restricted file that we're not allowed to see or change, but we can create a copy of it, restore it somewhere else, and perhaps now we can see and change it. We can potentially back it up after we've changed it and restore it over the top of the original. So indirectly, I've changed the data to a file that I wasn't authorized to. We also have the ability potentially to delete data from files with SaveSys. That's because all of the IBM I save commands support a directive that tells the operating system after the save is complete that we want to purge the data that was taking up all of the storage space. So if you do that with a production file or a production library and say free up the storage, once that save completes, you'll get a lot of open disk left, but you're probably going to have some very unhappy users. Each of these 8 privileges is extremely powerful and should be limited to just the handful of administrators most of us have on staff. But when we look at the state of IBM security study, when we see the averages of how many users have been granted these types of privileges, it is quite startling. When we start on the left, we see ALLOBJ with an average number of 150 profiles on each system we review. When we go across to the right-hand side, we see over 500 users with that powerful job control privilege, allowing users to end subsystems or to start print writers. And then that save sys authority allows us to read and change data, maybe even delete data. We see over 300 of those profiles on average. I would offer that a lot of this is the legacy of the system. We tend to create profiles by copying other similar users rather than using a predefined template. We also know that when we migrate from one server to another after the new generation of the systems has been updated, we typically don't rekey things in. We save it off to media and then we restore it to the new system. We migrate it. And that means we're bringing over the old settings, and we tend not to go back and look to see if those settings are appropriate. We simply move on to the next project once we've determined that the new system is operating exactly the same as the old one, perhaps with just more speed. So this is one of the big reasons we run into a lot of security issues in an IBM I configuration is simply because we have a lot of this configuration spanning servers. No discussion about user privileges is really complete without some discussion around object access. And for many of us, we're not really comfortable with how the operating system makes a determination whether a user is authorized to an object or not. Now, there's lots of steps involved in that evaluation, but I've broken this down into 3 primary ones here just to simplify it for the discussion. When a user says, I need to access a particular object in a library, the operating system goes through this algorithm the same way every single time. It is extremely consistent. So if you find that a user is accessing an object and getting an error where they didn't before, something changed. The first thing that's evaluated is whether the user has all object. I mentioned that was the keys to the kingdom, and this is why. If the user does indeed have all object, then access is immediately granted and no other authority checks are performed. If the all object is actually lacking, then the operating system will determine if the user has any private authority to that object. And private is simply specifically named for the user or a group that they belong to. If there is an authority for that user, whether or not it is sufficient, it's game over. There's no additional checks performed. However, if the authority is non-existent as opposed to insufficient, then it will progress to the third layer, which is checking to see if there is any public permission that will allow the act. Now, every object has a public assignment, so there will be a setting here, and it's really just a determination of whether it's sufficient to perform the requested task or insufficient, in which case the access will be denied. Now, by understanding this, we have to then realize that one of the common risks for IBM data is that the default permission associated with the public authority. Now, ideally, we have a public permission of exclude everyone, and then private authorities, which, as I mentioned, are evaluated ahead of public to open the door gently to those that have a defined business need. What we're doing here is just rating this against the opposite version, which is the public allow all, and unfortunately, that is the default state of IBM I. So if you just bring in a new server and you boot it up and you create some files and you don't make any changes to the settings, then every file that you create allows the user to not only see the data, but also change the data and delete the data. And this is a dangerous default configuration that has to be changed, but rarely is. We have to recognize, as I mentioned earlier, that users need typically a way to run commands in order to exploit these privileges. Now, it's not only the green screen here. We know that non-limited capability profiles can run commands on command line. I'll talk more about non-limited and limited here in just a moment so you understand where that definition is made. But I know many of you are familiar with the green screen command line and stopping users from having full access to that command line. If the user is non-limited, this is an open door. However, even if they don't have limited capabilities, some of them may be able to run commands directly from DOS prompts. They can bring up an FTP connection, for example, and issue delete lib directives without any regard for the limit capability setting. So I want to share with you a few ways that users can abuse the power that perhaps they've been given or have carried over the years in order to exploit the system. Again, if it's somebody deliberately trying to access the server or perhaps somebody other than the intended recipient of the profile, this can be extremely dangerous. But even with somebody who is simply making a human mistake against the database, this can be just as destructive. Most of the security controls are handled through what we call system values, and there is one that is probably best known, and that's the QSECURITY system value. Here, there is a definition of one of 5 different levels that can be specified, and if you are at level 20, which is the second level, then understand that anytime you create a new user account, that profile is automatically being granted the all object special authority when the profile is created. And I've listed here game over, and that's simply because if every profile has all object authority, every profile has access to everything, and you have no chance of securing it. Many of you recognize that, and you've increased your security level to 30. However, there is a known loophole here that if a user submits a job that leverages a job description that in turn has a named user profile specified on it, then at level 30, there's an interesting activity that allows the user to run that job. And that's because the user needs permission to the job description, but not to the profile that the job description is naming. Now, this is a violation by any definition. Unfortunately, it is not a restriction that is enforced, although the operating system will potentially log that that violation has occurred. If we get up to security level 40 or 50, this is actually the recommended security levels for you to be at. A user that has ALLOBJ can still submit a job as somebody else because, as I mentioned earlier, user profiles are objects, and ALLOBJ special authority gives permission to all the objects. So it is a perfectly valid activity in the eyes of the operating system for example, Security Officer Robin to submit a job and say, run the job as Bob. And if Bob perhaps has SecAdmin and IOSysconfig and other privileges that I don't have, then all of a sudden I now am running a job with more capability than I originally had. There's no authority violation in this scenario. I know it sounds bad when you run a job as somebody that has more permission, but there's no authority violation simply because the ALLOBJ says I have permission to that other user's account. It's obviously an abuse, but nothing here is going to be logged because nothing has gone against the rules. Also under level 40 or 50, a regular user, in other words, a non-ALLOBJ profile, can also potentially run a job as another user. And they can do this based on the premise that a user profile, as an object, has a public authority associated with it, just like a file in a program. And if that public authority is wide open, then it's important to understand that the user is well within their rights to run a job as that user. Again, no authority violation has occurred in the eyes of the operating system. Now, this is a less obvious abuse than the previous one. People have to understand a little bit about how profiles are objects and that there are public permissions, but anybody who's been around the server for any length of time is probably very familiar with the idea of running a job as somebody else. I talked about public permissions, and again, this is simply a default authority that is given to every object and is assigned and comes into play anytime access is requested and there's nothing more specific based on that user. So here we have an example of objects that are defined as public star change, and that is actually the IBM iDefault that allows viewing of data, copying, downloading of data, it allows changing of data, and it even allows deletion of data. What more would a user ever need to do? And that is the default permission associated with star public. So that's an extremely common risk. Now, if you've addressed that, if you have set your objects up, in this case, to be public exclude, then it all looks good on paper, but we have to remember that private permissions take precedence over public. They're evaluated ahead. Now, a couple of commercial applications I've recently reviewed made a big mistake. They had objects that were owned by a particular profile, in this case, IA group profile, and as the owner of the objects, that profile was given all permissions, and that's a private permission that is higher in hierarchy than the public permissions. The mistake that was made is that in these commercial applications, all of the users with similar requirements belonged to that profile as a group. So not only did it own the objects, it was also the group profile. And there should be a disconnect between those two, but when we combine them, inadvertently, what was happening now is that all of the users were indirectly owners of the objects and were getting all permissions. And we're talking about virtually every user on the system. And so while the public authority looked good, there was a significant loophole that was allowing all of the users to potentially download the data to a spreadsheet and email it out of the organization. A few other ways that profiles can be abused. Command line capabilities can be circumvented some ways through non-traditional interfaces. What I mean by that is that I talked of the green screen, but there are other ways to run commands. Many TCP services allow commands to be issued, and not all of them respect the limit capability setting. Now, you want to make sure all of your interfaces are secured using an exit program. If you're not familiar with that concept, let me know. We can certainly share some data with you. But We also have recorded webinars on that specific topic. You want to make sure you're selectively blocking those network functions from users that don't have a business requirement. And even when users need to access data through network services, it's much more rare that they have a requirement to run commands. So oftentimes you can at least block that part of the functionality. Bottom line here is we don't want to rely 100% on command line restrictions, menu restrictions, or even application security to prevent users from accessing the objects, because they may be able to do it directly through the operating system. I mentioned the group profile scenario, but one thing a lot of people forget is that special authorities that have been granted to a group profile are also automatically inherited to any individual members of the group. So if the group profile has SecAdmin, all of the individuals have SecAdmin. Now, with that being said, if a group profile has ALLOBJ, it's actually evaluated after the user's private permission. So it is possible to set exceptions or restrictions on users even though they belong to a group with ALLOBJ. However, it's not a big hurdle, because that ALLOBJ allows the user to submit a job and run it as somebody else that perhaps does have access to that database. So really just a speed bump, not a strong restriction. So we want to make sure that we are really restrictive on special authorities at not only the user level, but also the group profile level. Running programs with adopted authority is a valid technique to allow a user to run functions that they themselves would not normally have permission to. This is actually a great way to accommodate users who need to do things like start print writers and need job control, but that we don't want shutting down all the subsystems. By putting that functionality in a, for example, CL program, allows us to constrain that functionality specifically to that scripted function. Allowing the user then to run that script lets them perform the requested task without letting them have the entire power of the privilege. We want to make sure that we're auditing these programs, that they don't prove to be a Trojan horse, allowing a user to have additional privileges that we don't expect. Good example of that is when a program that adopts authority turns around and calls a system function like work spool file that has a command line on it, because typically that adopted authority will carry through to the command line. A little bit more advanced, but it's possible as well for somebody to define or redefine a subsystem associated with an interactive job. You can actually specify routing data in that subsystem description so that when the user connects to the subsystem, instead of getting a sign-on screen, it allows them to sign on under alternate credentials. So we want to be very careful here. Again, a little bit more knowledge required to do this, as opposed to something like submitting a job as another user or a profile with a default password, but they're all techniques that we've seen. As I mentioned, many things that happen on the server are accidents, and here's a couple of prime examples. This first one here is somebody who had enough authority to be able to delete a library, and unfortunately, he did so without having a tape backup. Of course, the panic there is get all the users off. How do I get this library back? But there's no undelete on IBM I. Once it's gone, it's gone. If you don't have a tape backup, you've got a huge problem here. And even if you're thinking to yourself, well, that's why I have high availability and a backup machine, understand that, again, if you do something unfortunate on your primary, the HA system most likely is going to replicate that function immediately to the backup machine, not realizing that it was an unintentional deletion action. Second example here is very serious. Please don't do this. This is a user that deleted an object in a particular library, actually made a typo on the object name, and has indicated the system has crashed. Now, if you're not familiar with the program QCMD, it is actually the command execution facility for IBM I. So once that program is gone, no other commands are going to run. So not only did they have to IPL this server, they would actually have to have IPL'd from a bootable distribution media. So again, the entire system save or the original disks for the system would have to come in play here so that the operating system could be reloaded. It can be done, but it takes time, and time is money, and it's not something you certainly want to have happen in the middle of the day. We want to be careful, again, not only from inside people but outside people, that there is awareness of the platform. We are not this best-kept secret always. There is familiarity, so This rule of security by obscurity is not a good way to manage our security, and really never has been. Now, I have two objections with this particular book, which is a real book. You can purchase it, although it's not an endorsement on my behalf. I really have two main issues. First of all, is that iSeries is an old name. We should be calling it IBM I. We want everybody to know that this is leading technology. This is not an AS400, as many of us tend to think it is. This is an amazing piece of cutting-edge technology. But more importantly, when we say hacking, we have a tendency to think of something where we have broken an existing operating system function. It's an unknown exploit. But the reality is what most of this book outlines is how to exploit the default configuration of the server. So it's taking advantage of things like that default public permission or profiles with default passwords. They're easy things to fix, but unfortunately many of us simply haven't done it. So let's talk a little bit about how we address some of this pain point, because I know you realize that these user privileges are probably not ideal, but we're terrified to take them away because there's only one thing we're more afraid of than a data breach, and that's the idea that we're breaking an application that worked perfectly fine. The first thing we need to understand is when we're creating new accounts, we have to do so more consistently. My suggestion here is to make sure that it's all defined out in a policy. And the role of this policy is to map out how the profile should look, ideally based on the type of role that the user fulfills. I like to have these policies defined by a committee. This is not something that an administrator should do on their lunch break. You want to make sure that it gains management sponsorship because it's typically going to take some budget and resources to define and enforce this type of policy. So you want to make sure that you've got the backing of those that can make sure that the users comply. The types of things we look for in the policy may be corporate level things, they may be geographical policies. They should outline the privacy expectations for your users, the types of access and applications that are there, and who should be accessing them. As I mentioned, I'd like to use templates when I create profiles based on the responsibility or the role that the user fulfills, rather than just copying another user. If you simply copy another profile, what you'll find over time is that the profile that you copied is changed, and then that becomes the source of the next copy, and so that we end up with this huge variance of profiles with no strong consistency between them. If a user is being set up as an administrator simply to create or manage profiles for forgotten passwords and other tasks, make sure that those managed accounts are safeguarded. Ideally, a user has the ability to self-serve their own password functions, and we can certainly help with that if you're interested. But even for those help desk profiles that need to do a password reset or a profile re-enablement, I'd much rather see them do that through an application than make them full-blown administrators. You also want to make sure any profile that remains privileged is audited. We look for profile activities to be audited, but I also like to ensure that any profile that has command line permissions has its commands audited to the audit journal as well. We want to make sure that these logs are being created so we have a breadcrumb trail of their actions. I've got a note here that if you do delete a profile, just bear in mind that's an object deletion event, something that some people don't audit. So if you have a profile disappear and you're not sure why because you're auditing security events, it's simply because it actually really is both of those things. It is a security event, but it's also a deletion event. And because the profile was not being exploited when it was deleted, IBM just leaned towards it being more of a deletion than an actual security event. As I mentioned, you have to be a security administrator to create a new profile, but you're not able to grant any special authorities to another user that you yourself don't possess. Oftentimes that means that people responsible for setting up profiles are immediately turned into security officers, and that's not an ideal situation. Bear in mind, if you do have ALLOBJ as the only special authority, you can potentially get the other 7 authorities by just simply running a job as somebody else who has them. When we create a new profile, we tend to use the create user profile command. We may also use Navigator to accomplish that. And what I want to do now is just share with you some of the parameters that are really key on the user's profile. There's lots of them, but I want to zero in on just a few that are really relevant to this particular part of the discussion. The first one is the user class. This is an IBM supplied definition of the type of role this user fulfills. It doesn't talk about order entry or warehouse shipping. It's simply the role to the server. Is the person being created an application user? Are they a developer or programmer? Are they a security officer? And there's 5 predefined templates. You can't add to them, but you can certainly leverage those and customize them, because really the main influence of the user class is which special authorities are being granted. Now, these are predefined again initially, but you can go in and override so that when I create Robin's account and I indicate that he is a programmer, he doesn't by default get any special authorities, but I can then manually override that and say, but I want him to have all object and SecAdmin. And this is a very common activity, and so we find in many instances users no longer fulfill the same authority assignments as they had initially on the template. And so my recommendation is not to put too much emphasis on the user class, but much more emphasis on the special authorities carried by the profile. So I've got that noted here. Again, defining the user by role is extremely beneficial, but the bottom line is we don't want to assign any special authorities either at the individual or group level unless there is a proven requirement. And let me offer that there is no justification for having 150 all-object profiles on a server unless you've got probably tens of thousands of profiles total. I mentioned the inheritance, and I just want to reiterate that as well because it is very important. Group profiles are automatically going to inherit down any special authorities, which if it's a desired special authority, that's a very beneficial thing. It's very quick and easy. You can add and remove it quickly. But I would offer that if you're trying to clean up your user profiles and the special authorities that are assigned, transferring it over to the individual versus the group oftentimes makes it a little bit of an easier task, because now we can do some trial and error on individuals without impacting the entire group all at once. Again, if there is a special authority that is needed on occasion, doing this programmatically using a script that adopts authority or some swap profile APIs that exist in the operating system are techniques that are common and are very beneficial to allow that function to be performed. Limit capabilities is the restriction that allows us to indicate whether the operating system is going to allow the user to run commands on the green screen command line. I mentioned that a little bit earlier. There are 3 options here: yes, no, and partial. And the way they break down is whether the user is able to run commands or override their initial program or menu. Now, while many of us are familiar with the work user profile and change user profile commands and that they're limited to just administrator function, here there is an awareness that there's a command called change profile that many administrators are not familiar with that allows a user to customize their own settings. So I've outlined here some of the things that can be controlled either through the change profile command or potentially through the sign-on screen. If you're using the default green screen sign-on screen, these are fields of entry that can be overridden, at least the first 3 are. And so we have to make sure that if a user is not limited, that we are aware that, for example, an initial menu of star sign-off can easily be overridden as the user signs in. Here's an example of a sign-on screen that has been overridden. Here, instead of having those extraneous fields that expose the profile to potential abuse, I've instead used it for a privacy statement and that I can monitor the user's action. So by signing on, that user has now agreed to that usage statement. So a good use of the new real estate. Even though there are some other functions associated with limit capabilities, the biggest impact by far is the ability for the user to run commands on the command line. Now, it's a little bit more complex than just running a command or not. They still have to have permission to the individual command, but this is definitely a big hurdle for a user to get over, and if they can accomplish that, it does open a lot of doors. It's not a user level restriction, which is a misconception that a lot of administrators have. It's actually done as part of a command definition. There's a runtime attribute associated with each individual command, so that if you are giving users command line permission because there's one or two commands that they just say they have to have, understand that it is possible to change those commands so that they allow the users to run them even though they're in a limited type of model. It's only guaranteed to be observed on a green screen. So if you have users and you're ruling your security based purely on limit capabilities, understand that without exit programs policing your PC connections, there may be ways to run commands through other interfaces. Same thing with QShell. There are other ways to run commands. So we have to be very careful if we are controlling access based mostly on command line or menu access. Another parameter on the user's profile is authority. Now, this pertains to the amount of public authority being granted to the profile that you are creating. So as I create Robin's user profile, this is the amount of authority that every other user on the system will have to it. The default should always be exclude. There is no justifiable reason, in my opinion, that any user should have public permission to another user's account. They, of course, need the password to sign on, but they don't need the password in order to submit a job and run it as that new target profile. If you're curious if you have that condition already in place, run the print public authority command that I've highlighted here in blue. Run it against the star user profile object set. That will look for any profiles that are not public exclude. Don't panic if you see 2 IBM profiles on that list. May actually be 3 IBM profiles on that list. So if you've got 2 or 3, it's not a big deal. Just understand that anything more than that is a problem, and reach out to us and we can explain more in depth. I suggested that you audit privileged accounts, and the way you do this is, first of all, by turning on event-level auditing at the system level, and you can use the change security auditing command in order to do that. It creates all the moving parts and pieces, but if you're not familiar with it and you don't know whether that's going to impact anything, certainly talk to us first and we can walk you through it. You want to make sure that you include the object audit value in the settings if you're going to selectively audit access against specific objects. But then in our context here, we want to consider auditing powerful users. There is a specific command to do that. The change user audit command allows you to assign and see those settings. Now you can see it through the normal profile setting display. You won't be able to change it, however, which will definitely lead to frustration that you can see it but not modify it. Just understand, for separation of duty, this command is separate from the normal change user profile command you're probably already using. You get most of the same options to audit at a profile level as you have at a system-wide level. As of version 7.3, there are 21 categories of event types that you can do. So you get almost that entire same list. There is one that you can't use. That's events that are associated with the intrusion detection system. That's because there's no profiles associated with an intrusion event. However, in compensation for losing one, you gain one. And the Start CMD option is one of the best. Now, it's available only at the user level. You can't do this for all users at once, and its intent is to audit the command line activities for your profiles. Now, if every user on your system has command line activity or permission, I would offer that this will generate a lot of traffic. But once you've got the system pretty clean and you've got your privileged accounts down to a more manageable number, this is a great option for at least keeping tabs on the CL commands they run. Understand, however, it is not all visible for things like interactive SQL or DFU, which are not command-based. So if you want true visibility, there are some tools that we can add to the system to give screen cam type functions over the user and audit every environment that they're in a much easier to interpret manner. We want to pair this potentially with object auditing if we have sensitive objects on the system. That command is going to be the change object aud, so we get a couple of custom commands around auditing. And that is pretty easy to set up if you have just a handful of files or programs that you wish to audit. It's much easier if you have a commercial auditing tool like Compliance Monitor from us here at Help Systems to do that. If you don't have that type of tool, then you can use some rudimentary operating system commands like display audit journal entry or copied audit journal entry to export the data out and write some of your own queries. But it's pretty tough going, just many times based on the volume of data that you have to deal with. Big recommendation that I have for everybody is always to try and stay strong. I know there's a lot of pressure to open the doors. The users don't like to be secured. Developers don't like to be secured. But at the end of the day, we can give a user all permission to objects within a library or set of libraries without making them all object users. So there are ways to kind of find a balance there between the two. Consider those auditing of those powerful profiles if you can, and try not to make a help desk user a security officer if all they're doing is resetting a password or re-enabling a dormant account. So in the last few minutes here, I just want to introduce a couple of solutions that I think are very relevant in your effort to regain control over profiles that have these types of administrative privileges. The first one is called Authority Broker, and the context behind this is that we want to allow a user to gain the authority they need on an occasional basis or when they need it without them carrying it 24/7 and without having oversight. So we take a premise of a user who needs to perform a restricted function. They can now elevate their privileges to get the associated power, perform the task, and then relinquish the privilege when they're done. Many times we find people signing on as QSECURITY or leveraging a privileged account in order to do that. But it's tough because then you have no accountability of who was actually using that profile. You also have to disclose to that user what the password is. So there is a better mousetrap here in doing it based on the user who's actually signed on gaining those privileges on a temporary basis, and having the auditing and visibility to their actions. So now we have administrators that can do what they need to do, the developer that can fix the broken application, but we're doing so in a safe manner. Here's an example of using Authority Broker to fix an application error. In this case, I've provided a reason for switching. I need to fix the payroll application, and that's going to be logged alongside everything else. I have the ability to enter a call ticket number, and then ultimately I choose whose privileges I wish to obtain. Now this is not a free-for-all, it's predefined, so you don't have to worry that Johnny the end user is suddenly going to become your security officer. It's a very controlled, tightly managed process, and alerts are issued anytime the function is used. We can also define if it is a timed or unlimited timed switch, meaning that I can say you can be QSECURITY for 60 minutes, or you can do it all day. Once the user has completed their task, or in fact while they're still doing their task, you can see what they're up to. There is a PDF that gets generated from the software and can be distributed through email that will show exact screenshots of what the user saw, including what function keys they pressed or what data they typed. So if they go into interactive SQL, you know what they looked at. It's very untypical to be able to have that clarity and that level of granularity as to the activities of your users, and the auditors absolutely love this. Through our Insight module, which is available as part of the Help Systems product portfolio, this is a free interface that allows use of many of our tools using a web browser type approach. We also have great dashboard analytic metrics. So here we can see a lot of different information about how Authority Broker is being used. Whether people have been trying to switch when they're not supposed to, how many times they've been switching, and what time of day they're doing it. Some of these include the count. So for example, if we're expecting an administrator perhaps to elevate their privileges 5 times a week, all of a sudden they're doing it 50 times a week, we're going to see a spike in those graphs and therefore be able to go do some interrogation as to what's going on that would have led to the increase in the use of that functionality. The other function that I would like to share with you is a great tool called Command Security, which allows us to have some additional oversight over the operating system commands. If you're an operating system expert, if you have ALLOBJ yourself, for example, you're probably aware that you can therefore run pretty much any command on the system, even if it doesn't make sense at that moment. So somebody with job control can terminate all the subsystems even in the middle of the day. The operating system doesn't apply any reasonable filters over that. It's all about just relying on your own common sense. Here we have an example of an attempt to change one of the system values on the server in order to turn off auditing. That's probably not something that would be considered desirable. So it has actually been prevented by command security. And the interesting thing about this is the profile that issued that command was mine, and I am indeed an all-powerful security officer. I have ALLOBJ. I have command line permission, which is normally non-constrainable. But here, the command security product has stepped in and said, I don't want you turning off auditing because it's against the rules. In fact, not only is it going to prevent it, but in my case, it used my robot functionality to send an email to my email account to indicate that the user attempted to run that change sysfile command. Of course, the message text is all customizable. I just happen to keep it very simple and say they were trying to run a change system value. The beauty of command security is that it's intercepting commands before they run. It's then applying some conditional evaluation of things like the time of the day or the day of the week. You can see the full list here. We also have user-defined, which means you can write your own conditional evaluations, giving it the ultimate flexibility. I showed you what could happen as a result of that condition. In my case, it rejected the change sysval command, and that's the function that everybody likes to see, the action. But there are other actions, including sending an email or a message, rejecting the command, as I mentioned, and overriding or modifying the parameters associated with the command as it was run. So lots of things can be evaluated, and lots of things can be enacted, not just blocking the command. So maybe I just want to send a message anytime a start SQL command is run. Lots of uses for this beyond blocking commands. I've used the example here of preventing auditing from being disabled by anybody. We could limit the power down sys to only super admins based on somebody on an authorization list, for example. We can send an email to a high availability administrator when a new library is created to give them a heads up that perhaps that library should be replicated. And lots of other examples that you can see here. And these are just some of the examples that customers have brought to us that we didn't anticipate the product being used for. So it's been really fun to see how people use this creatively to solve their business challenges. If you're interested in looking at this solution, it is available as a 30-day trial, and you can get that stuff installed, up and running, and be elevating privileges and controlling commands typically in under an hour. There are manuals, but we're happy to work you through that process with one of our support staff and give you a really good trial of the product. So let us know if that's of interest to you. The call to action I'd like to leave you with today is to actually run what we call a security scan. This is a risk exam for your IBMI. Think of it as an annual checkup. It's something that can run in typically under a minute, and we'll sit down with you and go through it line by line to explain exactly what it means. That gives about an hour's worth of review accompanying that. And there's no cost or obligation associated with this. So if you're interested, head out to helpsystems.com. You can sign up for that free security scan. We have to recognize that most enterprises running IBMI have got a lot of valuable data sitting on these systems. Presumably that's why you're taking the time to listen to this session today. And unfortunately what we see is a perfect storm is brewing, in that security awareness amongst most IBMI professionals is typically pretty low. It's not a discipline most of us have been trained in, but unfortunately the audit teams that often hold our feet to the fire and force us to learn it are not very familiar with the platform. So we don't get a lot of good advice. We don't have a lot of oversight from people that know a lot more than we do. So it becomes a challenge. We just run status quo. We don't want to break anything. We just leave it alone because nobody's bugging us about it. Unfortunately, I can tell you that most IBMI data is thoroughly unsecured. It is wide open to anybody that has a user ID and password, not to mention that the profiles on the system are far too powerful. If you'd like to understand how I know that, head out to helpsystems.com and download the State of IBMI Security Study. This is a free white paper. It's something we've published every year now for the last 15 years. We're working on the new study as I speak, and I invite you to take a look at that and learn what people are doing and, just as importantly, what they're not doing in IBMI security. I thought I'd just bounce back to my title slide here. If you do have a question, feel free to reach out to Robin.Tatam at helpsystems.com. I'll be happy to answer any questions. You can also find me on LinkedIn and Twitter. Happy to answer any questions, not just about this topic of security, but anything pertaining to IBMI. So that's our content for today. Hopefully that was a lot of useful information. I know I threw a lot of data at you there in a short amount of time. So if you do have questions, please feel free to reach out to us. But hopefully this will give you an opportunity to go out to your system and start taking a look and perhaps doing some counting of the number of privileged accounts that you have and determining if that's some cleanup work that you need to do. And if you need help in that process, let us know. We're always available for that function. Again, thank you for joining. Hope to see you on an upcoming session where we're talking more about IBMI security topics. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the remainder of your day.